The following is a presentation of Project Independence and WCWP. Project Independence is the Aging in Place initiative of the town of North Hempstead.
Welcome to Project Independence and You.
Good morning and welcome to Community Talk Radio. This is Project Independence on LIU Public Radio. I'm your host and producer, Kristina Liu, along with my co-host today, Otto, Lohse, longtime volunteer, supporter, friend, and my buddy, my personal buddy, I should say.
Good morning.
This morning, we are talking to Dr. Sara Glass, a PhD, LCSW, trauma therapist, and author. We will be discussing survival tips for leaving unhealthy relationships and coping with loss, and really dive into her personal story of survival and finding your voice. Sara, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And it's really nice to have you in June for Pride Month. Your book really just blew me away on so many levels. You know, it was just filled with just so many layers, whether, you know, it was just survival and coping with loss and starting over and just kind of having to navigate life at such a young age. It was just absolutely incredible. So really, really thank you so much for telling your story and for being here today.
Thank you. It's actually so nice to be out and proud because for the first 32 years of my life, I had to hide. And so it's just only been a few years since I began to celebrate Pride. It's just a privilege to actually be here having this conversation.
Yeah, well,
You know what struck me, Sara, with the complicated issues that you had to deal with made me really think about how many people in this world are born into situations that they really have no control over. And you basically started out being born into in this case, a religious belief that is difficult at best. And I thought about that. It made me think about how many people there are in the world that are born into different scenarios that maybe they don't really like, but they can't get out of. And you eventually did get out, which is an interesting story by itself. And then you have a long trail of other things that come into the equation. So welcome to the show. I'm glad you're able to talk openly about this all.
Yeah, thank you.
It all started when you were born, basically. Maybe you should tell us a little bit about what you were born into in Brooklyn, New York.
Yes. I think it's always good to provide a little bit of context. So let's make this visual. I was born in Hasidic Borough Park, which is an area of Brooklyn that much resembles 18th century Europe. My father wore a black fur hat and a long black coat. My mother wore a wig and clothing that covered up above her collarbone, skirts that went well below the knee. And everyone in my community sort of looked similar to that. The values were clear as well. Men and women never socialized together. People observed the strictest of Orthodox Jewish law. And I went to a gender segregated school up until the age of 19. The goal was to prepare me to be a good Jewish wife. And I was told that the only way to reach heaven, the only way to truly fulfill my purpose on this earth would be to marry a Jewish man and to bear his children. And, that was kind of like just the setting. The only problem was for me, I couldn't stop falling in love with girls. And so that complicated the life plan that had been set up for me.
Oh, wow.
Were there other people that you were able to communicate within this group that felt the same like you, or were they afraid to openly bring that up?
I think it's such a great question because, I did stay in that group for so many years. I also later became a psychotherapist in the Jewish community. And there are almost these little signals that people have to show that they differ. They'll drop tiny little hints. It's almost like being a spy in a foreign country. You don't want to be found out, but you want to find out who else is working for the same organization. And so there would be these little code words. Like if you mentioned having watched a movie back in Hasidic Brooklyn, or if you even heard of a movie, that was a code because we weren't allowed to have any screens in our home. We had no music, no TV, no screen. So if someone mentioned like, oh, I heard of a character named Clifford, and someone else was like, oh yeah, Clifford, the big red dog, and you knew a little more than you would know just from the books, it was like, oh, you might be a rebel just like me.
Wow.
You know, this
So
little
it's a very insulated life. You can't really.
No, and I think, the themes that you experience. Listen, our show is obviously geared towards seniors, but it's also geared towards the larger community, that listens too, which is nice to have you on. And I think a lot of these themes that, you had to deal with, whether it was, I mean, there was a lot of mental illness, trying to navigate that in your book, especially with your sister and understanding all that. And then it's, this theme of coping with loss, I mean, comes up all the time, especially working with seniors, and then obviously it could be something as losing a loved one or a friend, but it could also just be losing your identity in certain things and things that you're used to, so I think that your tips, I'd love to like kind of just navigate this interview with going through the tips mixed with your personal story, if you're down for this journey.
I am down for the journey. I'm a psychologist as well. And I do work with many people who are seniors. One of the only insurances the only insurance my practice accepts is Medicare.
Oh, that's awesome.
So we have a population within our practice. It's like people who come to us for trauma treatment and for grief as well. And also we work with many people who are, on Medicare. And so we work with loss and grief a whole lot. And I think this unique experience of living in a world where your friends have passed.
Yeah.
People don't remember like where you've come from or who you were. I share that experience because I have no one in my life right now who knows me from birth.
Mhm.
I lost my entire community and my family. And so I understand on some level what it's like to be a sole survivor of a society and to
So
look
as a
around.
result of this, you basically have been estranged with your, I know you have sisters and parents, obviously. Uh, they kind of cut you off, if you will,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
difficult.
It's difficult to go back to a community like that because the ranks are so closed and everyone within those walls of the enclave of Orthodox Judaism, they tend to be afraid of people on the outside. And so for my siblings, it's really frightening for them to have a sibling who's out in the world and no longer a part of their culture and their faith. And them, like for them to associate with me, that could have consequences for their careers and for their children within the community. And so we sort of keep a respectful distance from one another. I don't want to push them to have me in their lives. And also, I no longer want to put all the wig and the garb back on to go back into their world. And so I love them deeply and I'm sure they care for me too. It's just not really safe for us to communicate, even though they live just 10 miles away from where I do in New York.
It's
Wow.
so complicated. I mean, this is one example of what I'll call extreme beliefs. Um, and there are many in all faiths. It could be Catholic, frankly. It doesn't have to be Jewish. Uh, and it's difficult for anybody, to me anyhow. You're allowed to believe what you want to believe. That's my view on life. Uh, but the difficulty of some of these things, like you went through, I can't imagine what that's like. You're born into it. You really have nothing to say about it.
That's exactly right. And I think that's also very emblematic of the experience of loss and grief. It's not something we choose. No one chooses to lose a loved one.
Well, we talk about the word loss on this show often. As you get older, loss is a everyday part of your life. I mean, it's a loss of friends, family, capabilities, ability to do certain things that you could do when you were younger. I don't play baseball anymore, as an example. You just, loss is every day. You're losing something. And that's what you specialize in, is loss and trauma.
Yes, it's trauma, grief, and the intersection between queer identity, which is like our new word that we use to describe the LGBTQIA. We had so many letters that we just started using queer for all of it. And so the intersection between queer identity and religiosity is another thing that comes into my office a lot.
Well, could I ask you a question about that? For a long time, the word queer was considered a derogatory term to use. And I think I'm hearing you when I've read a lot of your material that that phrase is now an okay word to use.
Yeah, we reclaimed it.
Okay,
I kind of love, we took this word that was used as like a slur almost, the
right.
queer community, and we said, you know what, actually we'll take it back. We'll make it our own. And now there are so many people who identify with that word in a more positive way.
It's interesting.
Yeah, but I think
Yeah.
that just shows, the power of this and the power of, speaking out and sharing your story and all this. And you had sent over these really great tips, these 6 survival tips for leaving an unhealthy relationship. So I'd love for you to tell a little bit about the unhealthy relationships that you had to get out of and kind of tie it into these great concrete tips. We love tips on the show. We always want people to walk away with, these golden nuggets of information.
Okay. Pulling up my survival tips. I'm also happy to talk about tips for grief and loss as
Yeah, that's perfect.
whatever works. Okay, so I got married at 19 years old. And like I said, that was my destiny. I got married to a man my family chose for me. They did all the background research. They made the phone calls to find out what kind of man is this. He was 26. And I met with him for a couple of stilted conversations over Diet Coke in a hotel lobby where we sat on opposite sides of a couch and talked about things like how would we want to raise our families. That was like first date conversation, because the whole point of meeting was just to get married. I did have a girlfriend at the time. That's a little sidebar within the community. It was hidden and closeted and secretive, and no one knew about that. But I ended up breaking up with her to marry my first husband. And, I'm sure this might be the only audience where it won't sound as weird that I've been married and divorced and married and divorced. And it's like been through a few marriages. After 4 years of marriage, I was really struggling. I realized that I was not feeling comfortable, safe to be myself within the marriage, and that my husband just wasn't a person I connected with. I had 2 children by then, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I fought my way toward freedom. And that was quite a journey in the Orthodox community. They don't really like when you get divorced. And so there were a lot of different hurdles. I was supposed to talk to one rabbi who would give me permission to seek a divorce. The first rabbi said, "Why don't you take some Prozac?" And I was like, "But I had a social work degree at that point. I said, I didn't say this to the rabbi, but I had never heard of Prozac treating a bad marriage. Went to marriage counseling.
And if that's the case, they might do some new marketing.
Market this drug because that would be great, right?
Basically, just get drugged up and forget that you're married.
That was the rabbinic, like that was his best advice, talking to it like a social worker who had been working inpatient psychiatry, take some Prozac. So I chose not to take the Prozac, went to the next rabbi who said, why don't you try this marriage counselor? And after like months and months and months, I finally got permission from the rabbis to get divorced. And one thing I want to say about that is that people often think leaving a relationship means that you failed. On some level, your job was to be married. And if you couldn't stay married, you failed. And many clients come into me saying, I'm a failure for not being able to make this work. I should have tried harder. And those are things we tell ourselves. If I were only just a little more forgiving, if we had gone to a different marriage counselor, maybe we could have done it. And also that comes with self-judgment and shame. People are embarrassed for their friends and family to find out about a divorce because they think it reflects on their own personhood, on who they are. And so my first tip would be to say that quitting is not failure. You are allowed to leave a relationship that is killing you slowly on the inside. And that doesn't mean that you failed, just means that you've chosen freedom, chosen values such as being yourself, maybe even showing your children what true love can look like, or having children grow up, or even adult children see a world in which their parent prioritizes their own mental health and their own joy over obligation. And that's a powerful message, and I know some people may still be carrying around shame for many years ago from marriages that failed. And so I invite people to try to let that go, to forgive yourself, forgive the person you were married to, and just allow for the humanity to be there, for the experience of, we tried this thing, maybe it was good for a while, and we moved on. And that's okay.
Sarah, was your second marriage also an arranged marriage, or was this one you kind of went the route that a lot of people go?
Yeah. So after I got divorced, I was 24 years old. I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And a complicated story that I could go into, but in short, one of the conditions of my divorce, the rabbi said, like, you could get a divorce, but you need to sign this. And this was a paragraph in my divorce agreement in which I pledged to raise my children under strict Orthodox Jewish law. And they said if I wouldn't do that, then I would be relinquishing custody to their father. And so I wasn't willing to relinquish custody. I had babies and I loved them very, very much. And so I chose to continue to act like an Orthodox Jewish person on the outside. I would wear the full garb, the wig and everything. And then there were times I would sneak out of the community once it got dark. I would get into my car, and this was in New Jersey, and drive to Asbury Park. Like somewhere along the drive, I would throw my wig into the back seat of the car. Then I would slide skinny jeans on under my skirt and go and see like where the gays were at in Asbury Park. Swipe on some eyeliner in the rearview mirror.
Sarah, hold that thought because we're gonna need to go to a quick break. After the break, we continue talking with Dr. Sara Glass, PhD, LCSW trauma therapist, and author. You're listening to Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio.
WCWP is your home for great music and great conversation. You'll find all that and more on WCWP.org. Listen live on the web, check out the lineup, subscribe to podcasts, and stay up to date on the latest station events. Get in touch with us and let us know if you like what you're hearing. And find out how you can support or get involved at the only community public radio station serving Nassau's North Shore. Plus, sign up to get a free bumper sticker. It's all online at WCWP.org.
Welcome back to Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio. I'm your host, Kristina Liu, along with my co-host, Otto Lohse. We will continue talking with Dr. Sara Glass, PhD, LCSW trauma therapist, and author. Before the break, Sarah, we were just kind of diving into your backstory, and I really encourage everyone to really read the book. We're just touching the surface of things, but just the way that you navigated it and had to really live a dual life for a long, long time, even being called different names, depending on where you are. But we were before the break talking about your first divorce that you had to go through and how you had to sign a document. So we'll just jump right back into that.
Okay, thank you. And we should probably mention the book is called Kissing Girls on Shabbat. And that's a personal memoir that we're just skimming the surface of here today.
I have a question about the title, but we can get into that after.
Go for it. It's a conversation. Let's just have a
That's right.
Well,
conversation.
no, I mean, yeah, the conversation would be some people may not just explain Shabbat.
Yeah.
Basic term, but
Yeah, I take it for granted, having grown up in Hasidic Brooklyn and living in New York all my life. But, Shabbat is the Jewish day of rest. And so we observe that, or I did observe that in the past, from sundown on Friday evening to sundown on Saturday evening. And that's a time period each week during which Orthodox Jews don't use electricity, and spend time with family and friends and in prayer. And so the title "Kissing Girls on Shabbat," the holy day, uh, that's not part of the title, just it is the holy day. It was meant to just show my like gay side and my Jewish side in like one little phrase, so people would have an idea of who this writer was.
No.
Interesting. I think just going back to the when you talked about having to say your children could be raised in the Orthodox community, the rabbi had the power to do that, basically. Like in the world I think I'm exposed to, you would need a lawyer who does that.
Yeah, it's like an alternate reality.
Yeah.
Imagine a world just miles away from, or you're in Hempstead, is that right?
The town of North Hempstead. So it's like Great Neck, Roslyn, Williston
Oh,
Park. Yeah.
and we should get to the later fun part of the story where I lived in Lawrence,
Okay.
like in that neighborhood.
Mhm.
But we'll get into that with husband too. So the rabbis in Orthodox Jewish like tradition, there's a separate court system. And the court system is three men with beards, like in the basement of their townhouse, sitting around the table that get to sign and decide what's allowed. So, having been raised in that world, I believed that their word was the word of God, and that was the only word that mattered. In addition, they have over time learned to have the American court system back up what they decide in those little makeshift courtrooms. And so they have like these ways of taking the divorce agreement that they write up and inserting legally sound language and then having that notarized and entered into the formal legal divorces that people then go and obtain just for the purpose of, having like America recognize the divorce. And so the community is powerful. The Orthodox Jewish community tends to be powerful. They tend to be well resourced. They're very connected. And it's hard as for me, like as a young 24-year-old, I just simply felt like I was up against a plethora of people with more power than I had in that situation. And so those are some ways in which the rabbis do get to dictate terms of the divorce. And so because I agreed to that clause, and I did feel very afraid of losing custody of my children, after my brief little like trips out to Asbury Park or to Atlantic City in New Jersey, I realized that I needed to stay Orthodox on the outside. And so ultimately I married a second Jewish man, and he lived on Rockaway Beach on Long Island. We later moved together to a home in Lawrence. And we lived a more modern Jewish life. If you've ever driven through like the Five Towns, even the Great
Mhm.
Neck area,
Mhm.
that it doesn't look like 18th century Europe. The men are in jeans, and if you didn't know that there was a yarmulke, like a little beanie to
Mhm.
represent Jewish observance underneath their baseball caps, sometimes you might not know that they're Orthodox Jews. And even the women, they wear like highlighted wigs and they wear modern clothing. And yes, it covers a little more of their body, but they can pass, you
Right.
know? And so that's where we moved. And so I think that just brings me to another tip where I would say, one of my mistakes, was lying to myself. I knew I had to lie to the world around me, but in doing that, I also just denied who I was within my own body. And every time I started having feelings like, oh, I have to be with this man again, I just wish it were a woman. I would
Mhm.
have dreams about being with women. And I would wake up and tell myself, oh, that's just your evil inclination. That's just your mind trying to get you to sin. That's not real. That doesn't matter. And those lies to myself started to just chip away at my foundation of who I was. And I remember like living in the Orthodox Jewish community, my body was so tight all the time. I would just be so stiff. My friends used to say, "You have a monotone voice," because I was so stiff and scared that I didn't even like when I was happy or sad, my voice couldn't
Mhm.
even change that much. Um, and so I know like sometimes we're not yet ready to face our reality. maybe for some reason people, even not in the Orthodox Jewish world, need to stay married for out of necessity, pragmatism, for financial reasons, for safety reasons. Sometimes people are stuck in a relationship that's unhealthy and they don't yet feel safe to leave. And that's okay. We do what we need to do to survive. However, if we can just be honest with ourselves about that, we'll be a lot less traumatized on the other end.
Yeah.
So we can say to ourselves, like if I had said to myself, okay, I know I'm a lesbian, I know I shouldn't really be here, but I'm doing it for survival, at least I wouldn't have had to fight my own body as hard,
Sarah, your story is you have a lot of what I'll call hard life experience, and being able to work with people who are going through difficulties has to make you much better at it because of the prices you have paid in your life. I can only imagine what the alligators you were wrestling, if you will, between religion and forced marriages, basically. The good blessing, I guess, is that you did have 3 children out of it, but that was not easy either because you had to fight to keep them. My question would be, after the third child, and now you go back to having to fight to keep your children. Could just touch on that for a little bit. How difficult was that, and how did you manage to do it, basically?
So just for clarity, I did have 2 children within the Orthodox Jewish community, Victor and Jordan. They'll be attending college in the fall.
Oh,
And for
congrats.
that, yeah, thank you. That was part of what I wanted, was for my children to have a chance at education. It was really important to me that, I knew that if I was able to get them to college, they would have options. And so, and I do have a third child. That is correct. He's 4, so he was born outside of the community. So the leaving was with the 2 older ones.
So that was different.
Yeah, yeah. So it's been a very different experience parenting a child in New York City.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's difficult anywhere.
Yeah.
We're
Uh,
all
and so
we weren't all perfect when we started.
parents, you're like, yeah. I definitely was not a perfect parent. There's no part of this story in which I was a perfect anything. I
Nobody
think,
is.
yeah.
No, and I think, sorry, you were so incredibly young. I mean, the fact that like you got married, you were 19 years old. I mean, I can't even, like, I look back at myself at 19 and I can't even fathom, having to navigate all these feelings and things, and then being 24 even, and like embarking on this journey alone, and not having support. I think that that's just the hardest part of all this, is that you just feel so isolated. And I think that anyone of any age listening to this show and this interview especially, has felt like that. So it's hard to almost make a change when you feel so alone. So, but I think your message is that it doesn't have to be, right. You don't need to make that decision immediately. I think everyone's on their own kind of timeline, and I think by you sharing this story, and it certainly was a journey, where you were just figuring out and struggling with different layers, is important for anyone to listen to. And I so agree with Otto, because people that come to see you, in a therapist situation, it probably makes them feel like they have an ally in the situation, especially you're not just coming from some place where you don't understand, life experience. And I think that that's the most valued thing, to really be in a therapist.
Thank
Sarah,
you.
if somebody wants to buy your book, um, how do they go about doing that nowadays?
So the book is available anywhere that books are sold. It's actually in bookstores. I'm out in California currently right now on book tour. And so I got to see my book in a couple of stores out here, which has been, I just still can't believe that I was raised Hasidic as a Yiddish speaking young girl in Brooklyn's Borough Park. And I wrote a book.
Yeah.
I wrote a whole book. Like last night, I was doing a book reading at Book Passage in San Francisco, and my co-moderator handed me my own book highlighted, asked me to read a passage, and it was just so surreal. I can't believe I'm here.
That had to take, how long did it take to write that book?
So it took 5 years for me to write
Yeah.
the book. I wrote a couple of versions. My first version was very scared. I didn't want to write the real gritty details of what happened. My second version was angry. And by version 4 or 5, I was able to be honest.
See, but it's like the stages of grief, even just in writing this book, for you. And I'm sure it fluctuated, because it's certainly not like a linear process. You certain memories and experiences can trigger, whatever emotion, at the time. But
Did you go through a lot of self-analysis, if you will, during this process?
I'm a psychotherapist, so went to therapy between writing many of the scenes, and I would go into my therapist and say, okay, I'm going to write about this traumatic thing. Let's talk about it, but not enough to make me feel better quite yet. Let's talk about it just enough to freak me out so I can then write the chapter, and then I'll come back and we'll do the healing. Chapter, like already, with having those feelings tempered. I wanted to go into the writing with the full-on fear and the rage and
it's just such a therapy, in our program, Project Independence, is for North Hempstead residents who are, 16 over. We have social workers and nurses and transportation and just social things. But a new program that we have for probably about a year now, we've been doing this journaling program with our seniors. So, they get a book, and each week it's different prompted, thing to discuss. And on top of getting this little keepsake journal, you're also, communicating with your peers about your experiences. And I think that writing things down is such a powerful tool, for everyone of all ages, and especially our senior population, to get those words out there and to kind of think about things that you might not have, I mean, I'm a social worker myself. So, I mean, I'm always talking to my mom, about these things and experiences. And, you don't realize how certain things, affected you, right? Because it was just like in your past, and it just seemed like a frivolous thing, and I think that writing, and I'm sure for you, really helped your healing process too.
I think it was the thing that helped me the most.
Yeah.
I think it is the most cathartic form of healing. EMDR would be a close second. I also, when I got my book deal, I felt compelled to give back to the community in some way. And so I started narrative writing therapy groups.
Yeah.
My practice. And I saw what you saw, just people writing down the things that had happened to them, and then being witnessed by a group of peers was extremely powerful. So I highly, highly recommend that. And I'm so glad you're providing that.
Yeah.
The other part of the real world here is that the world is not quite so kind, and you're saying, you're a lesbian, and also anti-Semitism comes into the equation, which we unfortunately know does exist in the world. When you get involved with, the therapy, does this come up with people often? Like, how do you deal with that? Well, I'll be honest with you. I had the experience as a kid. I was born in Brooklyn, like you, and you're born into whatever you're born into. My parents came from Germany in the 1920s, and I was a kid I guess during World War II, and I was called a Nazi, and I didn't like that at all. All right, I remember chasing the kid around the block, and that, believe it or not, registered in me, in that I never called anybody a derogatory term. I didn't like it, so I don't think somebody else is going to like it either. So, in your world, there are a lot of people who are not acceptant of a lesbian idea, or frankly, anti-Semitism is an issue also. When you get involved with people with this type of thing, how do you go about handling that?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and I appreciate it because it's such a fine balance to hold both of these identities at the same time. For a long time, I felt like I couldn't be both Jewish and a lesbian because I felt like if I were a lesbian, my Jewish community would no longer accept me. And if I were Jewish, I couldn't be out and proud. And that's the challenge a lot of my clients face as well, is they feel they need to choose between aspects of who they are. Um, And so that's one, is just welcoming people to talk about that and understanding that it's complicated sometimes to hold multiple marginalized identities. In terms of anti-Semitism, I can't speak for everybody. You know, it's a hard time for so many people in this world, for so many people who are suffering and who are being discriminated against, Muslim people in our country and Jewish people in our country. We just are not living in a place where people feel as safe. And so I can just say, from my little corner of the world in the book, what I tried to do is paint holistic characters. I tried not to make every single Orthodox Jew a negative character. And so I wrote about the rabbi who helped me,
Right.
and the teacher who taught me what to do after my marriage, who then, when I was struggling, said to me, "This is not normal. Like, let me help you. Let me make phone calls for you." I tried to include the good so that I wouldn't be unintentionally increasing
Yeah.
reasons for people to be anti-Semitic. And that's the kind of thing I think we all have to be conscious of when we hold an identity or are part of a community that sometimes gets discriminated against.
Well, after the break, we're going to continue talking with Dr. Sara Glass, PhD, LCSW, trauma therapist, and author. You're listening to Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio.
Take WCWP with you wherever you go with the WCWP app. Listen live 24/7 to all of our streams, all from one app. Plus, call the studios directly from the app and visit our social media. Download the app through the iOS App Store on Apple devices or the Google Play Store on Android by searching WCWP Radio, or visit WCWP.org for links. The WCWP app, available now on iOS and Android devices.
Welcome back to Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio. I'm your host, Kristina Liu, with my co-host, Otto Lohse, and we've been talking with Dr. Sara Glass, who is a trauma therapist and author, and just an inspiration, Sara. I mean, I can't thank you enough. You know, during the break, we're just saying your story is just so inspirational. And as I said, even if you're obviously not all of our listeners are dealing with the same exact issue, but the common themes of survival and staying true to yourself. And you know, I love what one of your tips was, like, just being kind to yourself, you know, because I think so much of us beat ourselves up, you know. And when you explain those themes that you had within, that you weren't being honest to yourself, you know. And we certainly know that when your body is fighting against it, I mean, it causes illness and depression and anxiety, you know. So I think it's just so important to just, you know, we're always on the show, just like, be easy on yourself. You know, we're our own worst critic a lot of times.
And if I can just say just a little bit about going easy on yourself,
Yeah.
I think part of that is getting curious. If you find yourself doing something that you then judge, right? You're like, why the heck did I do that? Why did I make that phone call? Why did I raise my voice at that person? Instead of beating yourself over the head, get curious and allow yourself to compassionately ask yourself, well, what was happening for me at the time? And then try to understand, like, okay, so I raised my voice. That wasn't great. Also, I was feeling really scared. And that person said something that made me uncomfortable. And then you can work with yourself from there, you know, because when we're beating ourselves over the head, we're not able to really grow. It doesn't really accomplish anything.
You know, Sarah, one of the things that struck me is that you indicated in some of the notes that you had not been on the internet until your mid-20s. That just signaled to me that how sheltered you no doubt were and how naive you had to be about the world around you, which made this all the more difficult, as far as I see it, to handle. You know, I mean, if you grow up in Brooklyn, in a different part of Brooklyn, in a different environment, you become street smart in some respects, all right? And you learn things along the way. And frankly, in the long haul, it might be good for you to learn those things because you can contend with life better. But when you're like the first time you saw the internet, there are people around the world that are in the same category. They only see what people want them to see. How was that like? I mean, all of a sudden, like you look at the internet, it had to be like, oh my God, where have I been? you know? What was that
Yeah.
one?
I think I can also maybe relate to some of your seniors because I was pretty
Right.
in an olden time, where we just didn't have access. And again, more about that in my memoir, Kissing Girls on Shabbat. Um, so the first time I got a cable connection, I was 24 years old, and the technician came and snaked this little wire from the corner of my kitchen to the middle of the kitchen floor. And so the only place I could watch TV was off my tiny little laptop sitting on the kitchen floor because the wire didn't reach, further than that. And I watched Sisterhood of the Traveling Pans was my first movie.
I like that.
It was a sweet movie. And I just like wear these pants so confidently, because it was about pants and I was just
Yeah.
skirts. And I just saw like how free these young girls were in their bodies. And I just was like good for them. I don't know if I would ever feel comfortable like in pants as much as I wanted to wear them. And then I figured out how to buy pants. And then I found Grey's Anatomy, which is this medical drama. And I just illegally pirated it off a website. Didn't know I was doing that. I just didn't know how to work the internet. So I Googled it and I was like, here's the link. And of course, like then I got spam and all this stuff and needed to get filters. But I was gonna watch that show. Like nothing could stop. I was like, I realized that people were having intimate relationships and physical relationships with other humans that were fun, where they were happy and laughing and enjoying themselves. And I felt cheated. I felt like no one told me this was possible. I was just told that I needed to do what was required by law. I needed to just like kind of lay down and participate, not even participate, just be a bystander in my own intimate life. And so that was eye-opening and also instructive on how I wanted to live my future. It was, I was fascinated by everything. I was fascinated by just how women moved on screen and how at home they seemed in their own skin and how they used their sexuality or like their physical, like their voices to influence and connect and to move around the world in a different way than I was used to.
It had to be unbelievable.
Yeah.
I try to visualize you. Well, first of all, I didn't have a television till I was 15, but that was the nature of the beast at that time. Hardly anybody had television, but it wasn't as isolated as you were. You probably couldn't even get newspapers back in that world. Only newspaper they wanted you to get.
Absolutely. Our access to information was so restricted. In a way, I will say, like, it wasn't so bad. I later did my PhD dissertation on the topic of how media influences the body image and self-esteem of young women.
I know it's a complex. We talk about that a lot on
there
the
are
show.
negatives.
Yeah.
Plenty of them.
Was I lucky in a way to grow up in a world where nobody cared about how I looked? You didn't care about that. You had to get married. So I just went to high school with my hair in a ponytail and I didn't think twice about it. Never put on makeup. And, so there was it was a gift to be able to critically analyze TV because my brain was developed by the time I turned it on. And
Right.
to say like, there's no way those people look that perfect all the time. And then to like Google and find out that there were hair and makeup artists behind the scenes all the time. And I was able to say to myself, well, okay, these are things I want to embody. These are things I don't really relate to.
Now, how do your children navigate all this? I mean, they were so little when, you were going through like the nitty-gritty of everything, are they aware of everything? Have they seen anything with your book or,
So my children lived in the Orthodox Jewish community until middle school. And when they were 12 and 11, that's when I finally questioned my original divorce agreement and started a legal battle to obtain the rights to move them from the Orthodox Jewish community to New York City, where we moved to the Upper West Side, and I enrolled them in schools with more robust curriculums. So they've been here for it. I will say they had kick-ass college essays. because they have such
Right. I would think so. Yeah.
yeah, that's like a life hack. If you traumatize your kids to no end,
Right. There is light at the end of the tunnel, you know.
yeah, maybe like if you hire the right coach or you help them write, they know how to write, they can get into college and they will. I'm so proud of them. They also got to make their own choices. And so that was a big value of mine, a parenting value. When I decided to leave the community, I said to the kids, you can do whatever you like. Let's think about how you want to do this. I told my daughter, if you want to continue to wear skirts, I will buy you the best skirts. We'll go to the store in the 5 towns where like they have all the cool skirts. We'll get you all of that. You want to wear pants? I got you. We'll go get pants. I want you to think about what you want. And for my son, it was like, do you want to pray? Do you want to wear this black hat? Would you rather skip services in the morning? Either way, I'll help you figure it out. And so the kids are very independent now. They're able to really think through what feels right for them.
It's interesting. Basically you're providing guidance, but they're allowed to make choices.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
A little family tale. One of my grandsons gave us a great granddaughter about 2 years ago. And one of the things that they did, he and his wife, is they did not have the child baptized in any kind of religious faith, with the belief that the child will make their own choice when they're old enough to make the choice. And that naturally there would be some members of any family that would say, no, that's a bad thing. But looking at it and hearing our conversation, there's a little bit to be said for that. But this is all a matter of opinion. I'm not, dictating anything here. But there's so many of these things come down to, if you at least have the ability to be made a choice as to what you want. Like you were born into it, you didn't have a choice, and you could have stayed in there for the rest of your life and maybe be happy with it. Maybe not, anyhow.
No, but I think it's the communication piece, that all really at the end of the day, just how you communicate it with your children in an open and an honest way. I think it's just so important to really do that in all these circumstances, and just dealing with life in general and navigating the world. The power of communication and knowing how to do that and really just like listen and understand, I think could curb so much hurt and trauma and just in general.
Absolutely. I think, that would be one of my tips, is to try to say the scary thing out loud. If you're safe to do so. First, you say it to yourself and you get used to how it sounds to yourself. And I remember for 10 years, I was really scared to say I was gay, because that would mean that I would.
It's like real, right?
Right. Like I couldn't have this protection of being married to a man to maintain custody of my children. And then at some point, my second husband said to me in our couples counseling session, he said to the therapist, I think my wife is a lesbian. And I had been fighting and hiding that for so many years. And I remember sitting in that room and time froze, and all I wanted to do was shove the words back into his mouth and to say, no, I'm not really, I just keep having crushes on my spin cycle instructor or whatever, but it's just a little. All the lesbian erotica I hide behind my Jewish magazine, it's just for fun. Like I had all these signs, the rainbow hoodie I keep wearing to Saturday lunch, that's just all for fun. But in that moment, I looked at him and I just said, I think I'm gay. And that, just saying it out loud, like that was really the first step to being able to leave.
Yeah.
And so, if people like out there are holding something, and you know what, I think we all are. And as a psychotherapist, I work with so many people who are hiding mental illness, depression, anxiety, struggling in a relationship. There's so much fear around saying the thing that's true. But sometimes the greatest freedom is just in saying the thing you're scared to say.
Sarah, we've been doing this show for a long time, and this is one of the more really open, enlightening discussions we've had. It's a scenario that a lot of people don't talk about. They don't, for whatever reason. It's like, no, we can't talk about that. And I think it's been great. And, we've enjoyed talking to you, and we're not done yet, but
Yeah, I really love the format of your show too. I love that it's a conversation, so it's like we can really flesh out these ideas and get into it.
Absolutely. And I just also want to remind everyone, the book that we were referring to, Sarah's memoir, is Kissing Girls on Shabbat. And it's just, even if you're not necessarily, as I said earlier, struggling with your sexual identity, the other themes throughout it. I mean, we could talk to you forever, just about your relationship with your sister who really struggled with mental illness throughout the years. And because it's not recognized in certain communities, and this is across the board and in so many different communities, you don't necessarily get the help and that you need, which is just a painful theory. I mean, that you could have wrote a whole book on just by itself.
Like sometimes secrets can kill us.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people are in bad situations, whether they be, excuse me, seniors who maybe physically or financially or emotionally are being abused, spouses, usually a woman who's being abused in one fashion or another, and afraid to do something about it. Your world, maybe you're trying to explore the fact that you are really gay, or there's just a lot of things, and people, I think, have to be like you. We didn't get into all of them at all, but the tips that you have, which they could get in your book, by the way, are valuable. And you're talking from hard life experience. It's not fiction.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know, at Project Independence, do you have psychotherapy referrals?
Yeah, so our social workers and nurses are wonderful, and it really one-on-one will sit there, and we have a whole, like, we call it our toolbox, right? Our Project Independence toolbox. So just having people on this show, and then that we out and meet in the community. I'm constantly being sent different things, and we just share all these resources. So if a social worker sits with a senior who's the issues might be getting a little more heavier and they need to be more in depth, they do certainly have referrals that they can make.
Great.
Would
Yeah.
they contact you, by the way, if somebody wanted to, talk to you about therapy?
Absolutely. That's why I was just wanted to say, it's like if you're feeling scared to talk about something, sometimes the safer place to start is in the therapy room.
Yep.
And we do have a team of therapists at Soul Wellness NYC, SOULWELLNESS.NYC.com. We practice out of Manhattan, but we're virtual as well. And we're happy to talk to people about helping you get onto a Zoom. If you're like, oh, can you talk to my child to help me log in? We'll do that. Because you shouldn't have to suffer alone. And we do take Medicare. And so we're just there for people who want to have someone safe to talk to. We have a full team of wonderful trauma-informed staff that I work with.
Yeah, and I really, as we talked about earlier, I think having that experience and everyone, we can relate on traumas and on different levels, but I think it creates a comfortability. I mean, I know for myself, talking to someone that's been through, whether or not it's the same thing, but just things that you could certainly relate to, and these are common themes, that go back to just loss and survival. And I love the message of the first step is kind of just be true to yourself, right? And then you work from there.
Yeah, sometimes you saying it's looking in the mirror and saying to yourself, I'm not feeling myself lately.
Yeah.
I'm doing well, I need help. And it's okay. You don't have to do everything by yourself. This world is hard enough as it is.
Well, Sarah, we are at the end of our time, and you are just incredible. I mean, I could talk to you all day long. If you want to clear your schedule, we could just sit here and talk. But we would like to thank our guest today, Dr. Sara Glass, PhD, LCSW, trauma therapist, and author. Her memoir is Kissing Girls on Shabbat. We would also like to thank everyone today who has joined us. Coming up next is Talk of the Town. You're listening to Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio. Thank you.
Thank you so much.